am Taylor Guthrie. So I'm a social neuroscientist. I'm a fifth year PhD. So I'm right kind of at the end of my program, but I love everything about the brain. And especially kind of the social processes involved with the brain, kind of group dynamics, how we relate to one another. So, Dad, you want to introduce yourself, Andrew?
Yeah, I'm Andrew. I run the channel Sense of Mind. I'm a science communicator, neuroscience, psychology. Just really into everything about the mind and brain, and try to give people a good picture of how that works. And yeah, that's kind of my mission.
Yeah, and so we decided to start this podcast because we both have our own channels. So my channel is the Cellular Republic, teaching about how the brain works and kind of looking at kind of social neuroscience, things like that. And we actually met through YouTube, which was kind of cool. I think that kind of inspired, in a way, the name of the podcast. That we're two kind of brainy people getting together to talk about the brain, but pretty cool.
Yeah, I think we met probably through the comment section on one of your
Yep.
videos, I'm guessing. Yeah.
So we've done some interviews together in the past, and we decided that it was a good idea to just have a space to have conversations about some really interesting stuff, some stuff that I think that a lot of people can find impactful in their own lives. Something that I run into a lot, and I'm sure that you can kind of relate to this, Andrew, is that a lot of people think that the brain is really complicated. My view on that is that doing brain science tends to be pretty complicated, but the stuff that we learn about it can actually be distilled down into really useful and easy to understand stuff.
Yeah, I think that's true. For the most part, I think there's like things like you get down into the weeds of molecular neurobiology, and it starts to become a little bit more
Yeah.
difficult to see how it applies. But I think you're right. Like a lot of times, it's made too complicated, or it's not communicated in a way that is useful to people. And I think like that's what we're trying to do. That's what we're going to try to do here.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think the coolest thing about all of this is that we want this to be a platform where we can talk about a lot of different angles about this kind of stuff. The social brain itself kind of implies that we will be talking a lot about kind of social brain processes, but I think one of the coolest things about social neuroscience is that it involves everything, right? It involves attention, it involves decision making, it involves memory. So I want this to be a platform where we can really dive into a lot of these different brain processes, but also I think too the title, the social brain, also implies that we can look at society. We can look at the fact that society itself is an organism, that we're all individual cells within that, and look at kind of how we're kind of creating a brain of the human species, the social brain.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I feel like, the caveat is we're going to be probably presenting a lot of what sound like wild ideas, and what are a lot of them are pretty crazy, but they're like, this is a way for us to explore some of these, both the hard neuroscience, as well as what you were just saying, like individual cells and how that relates to society and social dynamics and group dynamics and all that. And so we're going to try to kind of, in this series, like draw a bigger picture that may or may not always be 100% supported by the empirical evidence. We're never going to say anything that goes against
Yeah.
the evidence, but we're going to kind of be exploring these ideas in like a looser way than maybe we normally do in our kind of, especially in Taylor's lecture videos, which, if you guys haven't seen them, go to his channel and watch those, because they're university level lectures on social neuroscience. Really awesome stuff.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Yeah, and so and I really like that kind of sentiment. Like I want this to be a place where we can look at different levels of analysis. We can explore biology, we can explore neuroscience, and we can explore society in general. Look at all of these like group dynamics, these influences that we have on other people, that other people have on us, and really try to connect all of these different things together and see how they fit, how our biology informs the neuroscience principles, and how the neuroscience principles inform the way that we connect with other people.
All
So
right.
I think diving in. So today's episode is really about life being a social process, and looking at kind of across the spectrum how every little piece about life in some way involves interaction with other living things. And so I
Yeah.
was thinking maybe we can zoom in a little bit and look at the cellular world, because that's something that's always fascinated me. I mean, one of the reasons I got into neuroscience, I always saw that there was something about life being left out of biology. That when you read these textbooks, when you look at all of these descriptions of all of these different molecules and everything, that there was something missing. The interactions between these things that were living beings that in some way have their own autonomy, right? These cells are uh, they strive to stay alive, right? They interact with other living things.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And um, I mean, I think that we we can kind of look at this as you were saying, like life is this social process, this kind of dynamic process, where like individual cells are interacting with one another in a social way. Um, but I think another way that we can kind of frame this, that if that doesn't quite make sense to people, is um, that life is a complex system, and
Yeah.
that's like an actual a technical term. And so I have this like definition from David Krakauer, who's the president of the Santa Fe Institute, and they study complexity. And basically, he says about complex systems, these are phenomena that we study as complex systems, the convoluted exhibitions of the adaptive world from cells to societies. Examples of these include cities, economies, civilizations, the nervous system, the internet, and ecosystems. So I think like that framework of where we're looking at this like dynamic interaction among the individual components of a system, that those interactions create this emergent behavior.
Yeah.
And that's what we call life, like in the case of cells and their interactions with one another. And even within individual bacterial cells, what we're calling life is this emergent behavior of the system that arises from these complex dynamics of the components interacting.
And each of these cells is communicating in some way, and this is becoming very prevalent in kind of the biological language, is talking about these cells as having communications with one another in kind of molecular terms. When you really think about language, and I'd love to do kind of a full episode on language in the future, our version of language as human beings is this auditory thing that we're communicating ideas. But in the long run, what language allows us to do is coordinate behavior, right? There was a biologist that that used this metaphor that was fascinating. He said if you were in a helicopter and you were flying over a swimming pool and you looked down and you saw this colorful thing that all of a sudden was a circle, and then it was a star, and then it was like a rectangle or whatever, you'd be kind of perplexed. You're like, what is this colorful thing down in the swimming pool? But as you get closer and you see that it's actually a bunch of synchronized swimmers that are doing these fascinating combinations with their legs and with their arms, instead of being perplexed, you'd say, how are these individuals coordinating their activity and creating these amazing emergent patterns when all the individuals really have is the interactions with the people right next to them, right? The individuals can't actually see the full picture, but somehow there are these just ingenious rules built into the system that allow this coordination and this behavior to actually emerge in the first place. And I think that when you're really thinking about dynamic systems are really hard to predict what the individuals are going to do. But I think that there are some clear rules that kind of dictate what kind of emergent property you can expect out of those individual interactions.
Yeah, yeah, and that's this idea of like spontaneous order or self-organization,
Hmm.
where this overall behavior of the system, in the case of the swimmers, the shapes that
Yeah.
they're creating in the pool, emerges, like you said, just from these relatively simple interactions among the individuals, just doing, maybe extending their arms and or doing whatever. I've never
Right.
synchronized swam before, so I have no idea. But yeah, and I think that is something to keep in mind. And you could think of it in terms of when it comes to biology, like the even just the movement of a human body is the result of trillions of interactions among
Oh,
cells, just doing fairly simple things, passing molecules, contracting
mhm.
muscles. That if you were at the level of the cell, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell what's going on. It would only be when you zoom out to that
Yeah.
bigger level that you'd be able to see that.
That you see lungs absorbing oxygen and spreading them through an entire like vast network of cardiovascular vessels. Like, I mean, that's something that has always just like fascinated me, is the fact that we're created out of these billions and billions of cells that each have the same genetic components, right? Every single one of them has the same genome, but they express that genome differently depending on the population of cells that they're embedded in. And something that's really fascinating when you look at kind of embryology, which is the study of how we develop from an embryo into a fully functioning like organism with tissues and organ systems and all of this kind of stuff. Uh, they did these really interesting studies where they would separate the two cells. So when the embryo first divided into two cells, they would separate the two of them and they would kind of let them do their own thing. They would also like explant cells from one stage into another, but what they found essentially was that it didn't matter when you what you did and how you separated this. What mattered was the populations of cells that were influencing how the thing developed. So a cell is only going to turn into a muscle cell if it's surrounded by other cells that are sending signals that we need to become muscle cells, right? If you take a cell out, if you explant a cell from a tissue, it'll actually revert back to kind of a proto stem cell like thing. Like there's something inherent about being embedded in this social environment that allows the cell to actually be what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, and then that's really interesting because I mean there was this research. I don't know, it was years ago, but this idea of induced pluripotent stem cells.
Hmm.
So not only can you watch that process happen where cells influence each other to turn into different kinds of cells, but scientists have figured out uh, how to take a mature cell and give it the right factors, the right molecules
Yeah.
and chemicals, um, and turn it back into a stem cell. So these things can go in either direction, really, I guess.
And that's, I mean, essentially what you're talking about is a form of language, right? We're communicating with that cell in some way. We're giving it signals that say, like, this is kind of what you're supposed to be and where you're supposed to go. There's other instances too, where like if you have cells kind of in a petri dish, right? They've noticed that the cells won't actually grow, they won't proliferate, they won't divide unless they're surrounded by other cells. If you take one out or if you take a couple out, those will just kind of just go off and die on their own. I think that says something. I mean, something that I love, and the reason I think we're starting by talking about cells in a podcast about kind of the social brain, is that there are these amazing similarities between kind of the social structure of these individual cells and the social structure that we see emerge kind of on this grand scale of humankind, right? And so maybe taking a look at evolution for a second, if we want to kind of take that route. So
Yeah.
my thought, it's really interesting because uh, I think this is why I got into science in the first place. I had these kind of realizations that there were these really cool similarities between the evolution of the organism and the evolution of society, right? One of the ones that really stood out to me at first, especially since we're kind of talking about language and about cells communicating with one another, was the evolution of communication in kind of the cellular landscape, right? So you start with these really these small colonies of cells. Bacterial cells ended up becoming the multicellular organisms that we see today, but it was all cell to cell communication at first. It was all individual cells just sending signals to the cells right next to them, right? And that's very similar when you look at like tribal communication, right? The first tribes of people, the only communication that was happening was person to person, right? But as the system becomes more complex, so as these tribes start to discover and contact other tribes and become kind of more vast civilizations, right? As the organism starts to develop and starts to differentiate and have different tissues, you now have a need for communication between different groups, right? You have this tissue that's made up of all of these kind of cells, and you have this tissue that's made up of different cells, but they have to coordinate in some way. And this is where kind of hormone transmission kind of came on board, right? You have these signals that are being sent from one group of cells to the other, and it's very similar to the Pony Express, right? Sending this letter on horseback from your community to another one. The whole idea is that there's this time lapse that happens, right? Hormone transmission is really slow. Something needs to happen, but it takes a while for that hormone to get all the way to that other group of cells. And it's the same with like delivering a letter. It's like we need something, but it takes that entire time of that person traveling to that other community. But then you see the next stage in the evolution was electrical transmission, right? And so what we see is this need that arose for coordination among these things that were becoming more and more complex. And electrical transmission now allowed for this amazingly fast coordination of like almost instantaneously, right? And it's the same with now we have radios, we have cell phones, we have all of these kind of things that now allow us as human beings to coordinate in incredibly complex ways, right? And this
Yeah.
is the whole idea behind like the name of my channel, the Cellular Republic, is looking at how the mind actually evolved out of a need for governance in a way, right? You have all of these different communities of cells that are all in a way they're cooperating with one another, but they're also competing with one another, right? They all need their own resources. And out of that, you needed some system that was able to coordinate all of that, that was able to allocate resources, that was able to understand what was going on in the external world and make decisions for the community as a whole. And I really think that's like the purpose of the mind, is this kind of governing force of the body.
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a lot because we have talked about that idea before, and I really like the comparison between human social life and what cells are doing, and I think it's really really good. Although there's one place where I've started to realize that I might tweak it a little bit,
Yeah.
and it would be that I think that you're completely right to say that the nervous system is kind of like this electrical communications system that has like arisen in multiple forms with um, whether it's radio and television or telephones and the internet.
Yeah.
um, I think that is a really good analogy for what the brain is doing. It's transferring and it's transferring information. It's also allowing for communication among various parts of the body, but it's also kind of storing information and making decisions. Um, but I think that it maybe isn't the best. The government may not be the very best analogy for it, only because I think that the real primary function of government is like protection of individual rights, and I would say that the immune system kind of seems to fulfill that role in
Interesting.
the same way that like police and military do in human societies. It serves this protective role, this differentiation of self from other, um, and that I think you're right to say that the nervous system is coordinating everything, but I think it's doing it in a way similar to how our whole network of just communications infrastructure in human societies does it, which is by communication among individuals with intermediates between them. So like the heart has to pump blood when like the muscles need it, as a really simplistic
Hmm.
example, but it goes through the brain, and there's complex feedback loops between the organs and the brain, and it's not necessarily just a top down control from the brain.
No, I absolutely. I think one of the interesting things that you point out here, and I think something that I really anchor on a lot, is the idea of decision making, right? And the flow of information. So I mean, I think something Freud gets a lot of flack in like the psychology world, but I think something that he was really kind of profound with was this idea of the unconscious, because our awareness is only a very small fraction of all of this amazing complexity that we have in our body. These, like you mentioned earlier, just moving a muscle is trillions of interactions, right? And so what I see, the reason I kind of use governance as this metaphor is looking at the idea of the flow of information up to the top. And if you look at how someone who is running a government, the kind of information that they have access to is very similar to the kind of information that our consciousness has access to, right? Like the person running a country does not have access to how the individual components of the healthcare system are interacting with one another, how the police force is doing their job. They have just information, which is usually in the form, especially in today's world, in the form of media, right? And I think that our attention mechanisms kind of are like the media in our body. They're pulling out just information, right? They're pulling out like what are the really important things that are happening right now. I just stubbed my toe. Oh my gosh, there was this crazy violent thing that happened in this community of cells down in my toe. Like that's like headline news right now. And that informs my decision making process, right? And so whatever information is brought to awareness is the information that has been packaged in a way that is like being brought to like the king or the CEO of a company or whatever, is like, okay, these are the most important things that we're facing right now. Now it's your responsibility to make these decisions. And that's something that I lean on a lot, that I probably am going to talk about throughout the series, is this sense of responsibility that this gives us as individuals, right? If we view ourselves, our awareness, our consciousness, as being kind of the leader of these billions and billions of cells that we're essentially in charge of or responsible for, it shifts the responsibility to us to put in the work to make sure that we're making healthy decisions, to make sure that we're doing the right things, right? It's very different than a lot of what the culture had built in, especially around kind of these religious ideas of uh, things are happening to you because you're a bad person and like God is punishing you. That takes the responsibility away from you. But if we can shift it back and we can say, okay, our body is giving us signals. Our body is telling us certain things about our energy levels, about our fatigue, about how healthy we are, and it's delivering that in the form of this headline news to the person in charge, to the awareness, the consciousness. And we then in that moment have to make a decision about whether we're going to listen to those signals or whether we're going to act selfishly, some authoritarian government would.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because it seems like the the brain in some ways are we it acts only in its own, like, according to its own interests, really. Like
Yeah.
the toe may be hurting, but it, like, the brain only really cares about that because of the consequences of what's going to happen if the toe is broken. I won't be able
Right.
to satisfy my desires in some other way, and so now I need to, like, pay attention to this and take care of it. And like, it always seems to come back to, like, the brains. It's like a brain centric thing, but I mean, it has the effect of taking care of the whole body for sure. But just a kind of a observation
Yeah.
there.
No, no, that's really interesting. And so I think the interesting as we zoom out, right? So now we have these incredible multicellular organisms. That whole process, I mean, we're talking millions and millions of years, multiple mass extinctions, right? We've gone through what, at least 6 or 7 mass extinctions that extinguished like 97% of the species on the earth. That whole process was all this like incredibly social process. All of these organisms were all interacting with one another in certain ways. They were all striving to stay alive, and that kind of promoted this either cooperation or competition thing that kind of unfolded across the landscape. That is a very social thing, right? Uh, and that's interesting, as like kind of what you said, and I think something I kind of wanted to delve into a little bit is this difference between individuality and like collectiveness, right? When we're talking about cells, like we mentioned at the beginning, that these individual cells, they have their own kind of autonomy, right? They are essentially making decisions. I wouldn't call them like very complex decisions, but I personally think that cells are sentient to a certain extent. They know that they're alive and want to stay alive. And they have their own personal goals to stay alive. But there's also this group goal. There's the organism, like what the organism needs and what the organism is kind of imparting on that individual. And it's the same in society, right? Each of us have our own individual goals, but then we're also part of groups. We're part of our family group, we're part of our friend group, the leisure groups, we're part of the society that we're a part of. And our individual goals are usually in some way in competition with these groups that we're a part of. And it's ultimately, I think that's where like group dynamics is really interesting, is balancing those. And I think that's something that society has faced for a long time, is how do we promote these group goals and get everybody on board? The organism does that really well. Um, but um, but how do we still respect kind of individual autonomy?
Yeah. Well, I guess I would first uh, kind of challenge the idea that the cells are sentient, if by sentience we mean like uh, s- capable of some kind of subjective experience,
Yeah.
consciousness. Um, because I think that's kind of where the analogy, where like the rubber meets the road, because
Hmm.
to me the moral component comes in at the level of the individual organism, the individual, or like, sorry, the individual person. um because we are capable of suffering and well-being. And when it's at the level of the individual cell, it doesn't matter, like there's not that, it doesn't, I don't care if a cell, my skin cell dies, you know it doesn't really matter to me. And I think that's like a very important distinction, because um, you know organisms, multicellular organisms, can act in a way where all of the individuals' goals are completely subservient to the collective's goals. And I think that's why that is why they are able to act in such a well coordinated way, because their goals are fundamentally aligned with the survival and well being of the collective. And I think that stems from the fact that they're all literally clones of each other. Your cells are just trillions
Yep.
of clones, and so they've evolved over hundreds of, millions of years to be uh, basically components, like gears in this system. Whereas humans, like, we are kind of fundamentally have different goals than one another. And I think that the way that we have to come to cooperate is to basically, like, respect each other's individual rights. And I think like that allows for cooperation to emerge. There's going to be competition among groups, but fundamentally, like, our interactions with each other are most often going to be cooperative, even if we are just following our own self-interest for the most part. I don't know. What do you
So
think of that?
yeah, so I have a couple of points. So the first thing you brought up was sentience, and it's hard to throw these words around, especially like sentience, consciousness. I mean, it's something that I want to put out as like a caveat from the get go, is that these metaphors, looking at things as being social, like the cellular sociology or whatever, they're metaphors, right? They help us to understand these phenomenons. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily real, right? We want to avoid this kind of gratuitous anthropomorphism. We don't want to give like human qualities to these cells that don't have the ability to have cognition like we do. But what I see is what I believe is that there is some form of like basal cognition, right? That individual cells have a form of cognition, and you can see this in terms of like bacterial cells experience Pavlovian learning, right? You can put a rod with stuff on it and tie it to some kind of a cue, and uh, I don't remember like the full details, but there's tons of studies about bacterial cells being like able to be influenced by Pavlovian conditioning. And there's also these studies where they look at how if you take these two individual cells that are healthy cells, and you have them on a petri dish and they're kind of moving around trying to find each other, when they come into contact with one another, they will like stop for a moment and they'll like communicate a little bit and then they'll kind of move away. Cancer cells don't do that. Cancer cells will just like crawl all over each other without any
Mm.
kind of like respect to the other one. What that kind of says to me is that there's something about the interactions themselves. There's something about those individual cells having a certain type of cognition, a certain type of being alive. I think that's what I really mean by sentience. There was a quote from, I think it was from the Upanishads, and I'm probably butchering it, but it was the first thing that ever came into existence was immediately afraid. And I don't necessarily like the word afraid because we can't really like put fear onto these things. But what it said to me was that there's a driving force behind life, right? That living things don't want to die. And it creates this. You kind of hear about this in like existential philosophy. I think Schopenhauer was really big talking about this needless striving that all living things have. This striving to accomplish things. And you can kind of look at it in terms of like hierarchies, right? So really simple organisms, the striving is all based around survival needs. It's all based around these physiological things about maintaining our nutrient state and like making sure that we have connections with these other things around us. I think that you're entirely correct, and kind of moving to one of your other points in terms of cells within an organism being in a very authoritarian uh, type society, right? Because they've essentially lost a lot of their individuality, right? And that's this whole idea between collectivism and individualism, is that there are certain instances where a society is able to remove the individuality from the people that are kind of creating that system, and they shed that individuality in replacement for the group's goals, right? And you pointed out something really important in the fact that they're clones. So when you look at the evolution of multicellular organisms, right? The very early stages from going from single cells to this like differentiated, like different tissues, being able to replicate all of this. There are these things called slime molds where they all of the cells, there's these huge colonies of bacterial cells. And all of the individual cells in a slime mold are kind of connected to one another in a way. They're sharing information, but there's no differentiation. They haven't figured out how to what they call export fitness. Like, I'm going to take care of protecting the organism, you take care of digestion, right? And what they think the reason for that was because these colonies of bacterial cells were not clones. And so they had free rider problems where they had cells that were just sitting around, just like raking in the benefits of being in this colony without doing anything. And they also had deserters because of the fact that they weren't clones. They think that the first actual multicellular organisms were clonal colonies. And it was because of the fact that each of those cells was on kind of the same goal. They had the same thing in mind. They were all trying to achieve the same thing. And that's kind of like blowing back up to kind of the societal level. That is something it's really prevalent in our society, is this tension between individual goals and collective goals. And what's really interesting as humans is that we have language, right? We don't have to be clones with one another because we can actually communicate our rights to one another. We can
Right.
create these complex symbols that represent why you shouldn't be a free rider, why you shouldn't desert this colony. We can actually create entire messages and visions about why we should be in this group in the first place, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's really cool because I mean, when you're talking about the cognition of an individual cell, I think we could like drill into that a little bit because
Yeah.
I agree. I think it's a good way of thinking about it. Like a cell is basically kind of like this little, I don't know. I mean, and it is its own little organism. And
Mhm.
when we say like cognition, and what we're talking about is these set of biochemical pathways, really relating ultimately to that cell's DNA. and the precise sequence of DNA, and how when it finds itself in a certain environment, how those mechanisms play out and influence its behavior. And so, like, that's kind of, I think, what we mean by cognition in a cell. And I think you're making a really good point, because as individuals with these big brains, we can think explicitly about these ideas of rights or whatever it is, and and it's kind of like this, we create this shared cognition, this culture, really, that serves the role that the shared DNA of the bacteria, or sorry, of your cells in your body have. It kind of replicates that role to some extent. The only thing I was going to mention is there's this, because you said the first multicellular organisms may have been clonal colonies. And I'm not really sure how this relates to the evolution of multicellular organisms, but I remember reading about this really cool, I guess it's a bacteria, but it's a protozoan. It's called Mixotricha paradoxa, and it's
A
really
mouthful.
cool. It's got, so this is from Wikipedia, but I'll just read it. It says, it is composed of 5 different organisms. 3 bacterial ectosymbionts live on its surface for locomotion, and at least 1 endosymbiont lives inside to help digest cellulose in wood to produce acetate for its host. So not, and then in addition to that, so it's got all these organisms. It's got bacteria that serve, I believe, as like the joints of its arms, or
Interesting.
whatever
Yeah.
you call them, podia, I think they're called. And then it has its own like microbiome inside to help it digest the cellulose from wood. But why does it need to do that? Because it itself is a bacteria living in the digestive system of termites. So it's like this just Russian doll of like
Right.
organisms going down. And I wonder if, and then thinking about us, we also have a microbiome that is really important for our health and everything. And I wonder if it's possible that different different organisms could have evolved to into this sort of cooperative arrangement, even if they weren't the same, like from the same clonal colony. And another, sorry, I know I'm going on here,
you're all
but
good.
another example of that is within all of our cells, we have mitochondria. Mitochondria are these little organelles that produce basically all of the energy for your entire body. They convert, carbohydrates and oxygen and water into energy, ATP, for your body. And it's thought that these mitochondria were originally these microcellular, or these microbes, these little bacteria basically, and that at some point it absorbed itself into, or was absorbed by, a larger bacteria, which was kind of like the precursor of all eukaryotic cells, all of our cells. And so like that original kind of like social evolutionary arrangement has led to how we are today, I guess.
And I think you're getting into something really interesting, and that's the idea of the degree of complexity, right? And so there are these situations where you can have these different organisms, kind of like, that aren't clones, right? Kind of coming together in this symbiotic way to help each other, but I don't think that those types of symbiotic relationships allow you to achieve the kind of complexity that we see with like cardiovascular systems and the liver and the immune system and all of these incredibly complex things that I think needed some type of kind of every cell on the same page kind of thing to get to. And I think the underlying idea here is, I mentioned the term earlier, it's this idea called exportation of fitness, right? So when you're in a group, and so we can look at this in terms of human groups, we can look at this in terms of biology. The ultimate goal as you're becoming more complex is to spread the workload, right? Like when you're a small, not super complex thing, each individual is responsible for their own everything, right? every single cell has to digest their own food. They have to protect themselves. They have to do all of these different things themselves. Exportation of fitness is saying, okay, I'm going to take on this role. I'm going to be the protector. I'm going to form this lining around the organism. But in order to do that, I have to lose all of the ability to digest food. That's really energy intensive, right? But now you have all of these cells that are in the middle of that colony that don't have to protect themselves, that can now lose that ability and just digest food and can send those nutrients back out to the ones on the outside that are protecting the organism, right? And the really cool idea when you're looking at that in terms of society, right? Something that's fascinating about language is that we're now able to communicate exportation of fitness, right? Instead of actually having to have this biological process where, like, I've lost the ability to do something, and we're now in this position. You look at like tribes and the growing societies. I can say, I'm going to do this job. You go do that job, right?
Yeah.
And I think that what we're seeing is that this whole like evolution into this really complex multicellular organisms required this really kind of like everyone on the same page, this authoritarian type view. But now we're able to create what looks like a multicellular organism society, right? We have roads that look like cardiovascular systems. We have a healthcare system that looks like an immune system, right? We have all of these, like, and you mentioned earlier, like the police system, like all of these incredible systems. Like we harvest our own food and we spread all of those nutrients out in the form of supermarkets, right? We're able to do that without being biologically connected to one another. And I think that that's what's so fascinating about language, about our ability to transmute these representations. Because what you mentioned earlier was this idea of cognition, right? Getting back to kind of this idea of basal cognition. There's this fascinating book called The Evolution of Memory Systems by Elizabeth Murray, where they look at evolutionarily, like, how has memory changed? And I'm kind of using memory as a plug for cognition, because ultimately what I think cognition is using some type of internal representation to predict what you're going to do in the future, right? That's ultimately what Pavlovian conditioning is, right? Is that you've noticed that there's a connection between this bell and this food, and so now that internal representation allows you to predict when there's going to be food in the future, right? But as the organisms became more complex, as the stresses of the environment started to change, there appeared new types of memory, like instrumental learning, where you can go around and you can just randomly try a bunch of stuff until something works, and then you can go with that, right? Then they figured out that we have the ability to have like aversive learning, which is this long-term learning, right? I can eat something that makes me sick, and I can remember that that was from something I ate hours ago, right? It's like the basis for this kind of long-term cognition. But we now, as humans, have deliberative cognition, right? We can actually take all of these internal representations that we have and we can compare them to one another. We can create these symbols. We can think about possible solutions in the future, and we can actually like simulate that whole thing and say, like, there's a great example that Joseph Ledoux put out. Um, let's say that you're being chased by a bear and you're up in a tree, right? The really cool thing about being human is that while I'm sitting in that tree, I can think, if I go for the river, I can try to swim. I'm not a very good swimmer, so I might sink. So that's probably not a good way to go. But what if I tried to climb over to this other one? Well, I could fall. You can go through all these different scenarios, right? And so that was kind of getting back to this idea of sentience, this idea of cognition. We can't assume that these other living things are able to think like we do. But I don't think that that doesn't mean that they're not alive, right? And I think that kind of coming back to our overall kind of theme and idea of the episode is that life is a social process, right? It's all about communication, right? There was this whole field of reductionism of like, if we understand all of these individual components, then we're going to understand how the system works, right? There's the whole genome project. Like, once we figure out what all of the genes and the DNA are, we're going to know how we're going to find all of the drugs, we're going to cure illness, we're going to do all of this stuff. But that doesn't work, because in order to truly understand the system, you need to understand how all of these individual pieces are communicating with one another, interacting with one another, are like having these incredible complex dynamics.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's so true. And I think it's like it's good to reflect on what language is, and and why it is so important for these processes, because it's not just talking. It's not just like
Hmm.
me and you on a live chat, talking about the brain. It's like what language is certain. Well, I guess what communication is really is my behavior doing something to you in a way that influences your behavior. And that sounds like
Yeah.
too broad to be communication, but I think when you really boil it down, that's what's going on. Is like I'm whether I'm a bacteria or a multicellular organism, like my actions are going to affect your sensory apparatus in some way. That's going to like feedback into your like internal cognition system, and allow you to take some action based on what I'm doing. And so like that does lead to what you were talking about, like basically the division of labor, that it
Hmm.
allows us to decide like, okay, well, oh, and all another like economic concept. Oh man, I just had it in my head, but the comparative advantage, basically, like I might be actually like better at doing this one thing. If I'm a cell, maybe I'm just slightly better suited to like protecting the organism, or something like that. Whereas like you have a few more digestive enzymes or something that allows you to become the digestive system. But we only are able to kind of like that's only turns into this big um, division of labor that allows us to like multiply the production of energy and things like that, when we can communicate, when we can have some sort of coordination through the
Hmm.
system.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think about I'm a big philosophy buff. I love like existential philosophy, and that just kind of made me think about these ideas from Sartre. This idea of facticity. So it's our choices. Our choices are not free. I've always hated the term free will because our choices in society are constrained by lots of things, right? I think that we are making decisions, but I think that they're extremely constrained. And so what he talks about is this idea of facticity, that we are embedded in a particular culture. We're embedded in a particular family unit, in a particular religion in most cases, all of these kind of things. And we also have a particular set of skills, right? What you were saying, like if you look at it down at the cellular level, like this cell, its facticity was the fact that it had different digestive enzymes. And so it was more suited to do this thing, right? And so much of our lives, the meaning making that we do in our lives, is centered around this exportation of fitness, this division of labor. Like, where do I fit into society? So much of the meaning that we make in our life is tied to other people, right? It's tied to trying to find how this thing that I'm a part of, how is it that I fit into that? What is my job? What are my skills? What do I bring to the table? And I think that's what makes a lot of this social stuff so fascinating, is that we do have these individual desires, these individual strivings, but a lot of them are tied to this kind of group identity, this group goal of being a part of something greater than ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. It definitely it reminds me of there's this theory in psychology called um, man, I'm like blanking on the actual name of it, but it's basically like a theory of motivation, and it has to do with us having these basic psychological needs, and that like they kind of posit that there's three of these, that there's autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And I think it's like as humans, we might have these three needs that kind of come together in the context of society. And like
Yep.
what I mean by that is autonomy is really important, right? So like being able to control your life, control your own choices, do what it is that you want to do. That's important for our psychological well-being. But also competence, like being good at something. And then
Yep.
also relatedness, like so being embedded in this supportive community, and like being a part of that, being part of something greater than yourself. And it seems like with especially with the competence piece, we can kind of find things that we're good at within that larger structure or that larger societal structure that kind of allows us to also get that community piece, because we're kind of like striving toward this shared goal, but also like we are specifically competent and good at this one thing.
I mean, that's something that I mentioned in. So I made a video about social neuroscience. I think that's the one that we met because of. But it was this idea that a lot of researchers are kind of proposing that our need to be accepted, to belong, is as strong as our need for thirst and for hunger. Like the physiological effects of being isolated are intense. The kind of like stress responses that you go through, like declines in memory and cognitive function, all of these kind of things. And so I think what's fascinating to me as a social neuroscientist is that everything that we've just talked about has kind of um, paved the way for our brain to evolve kind of around these social processes, right? And that's why I think it's so fascinating to think about like uh, how. So I started in memory research, right? And I loved what I was doing. I was studying the hippocampus, but I was studying this just like really small part of the brain. And I've always been kind of more of a generalist. I want to know how all of these pieces kind of interact with one another. And I found social neuroscience and I was like, oh my God, this is it. Because everything that we've just been talking about is about how our brain has been motivated to accomplish these very social things, right? And so our attention mechanisms are wrapped up in that, right? We're constantly looking for any type of indication of whether we belong, whether we're recognized, whether we're appreciated, right? Our decision making is very much influenced around all of these like belonging to society. Where do I fit in? All of this kind of stuff. And all of our memory processes are very kind of centered around a lot of these social processes as well. And I don't think that it's a surprise that a lot of the stuff in the brain that pops up around social cognition is in what we call the default mode network, which is like the region that's like pretty much always on, right? It's like it's constantly driving us towards connection, driving us towards recognition, driving us towards just like being a part of something. And so, I mean, in future episodes, we can dive more into some of these like social neuroscience properties. But I think this is a really cool way of like kind of setting the stage and the foundation for like why it matters to look at the social brain.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I agree completely. Um, no, I think you said it well. I think um, it's interesting because we like kind of think of ourselves as, and I think we are like both individuals, but also part of this larger collective. And I think that is this fundamental tension about being a human, and then it shows up in our brains because so much of every brain system has something to do with social, our social selves, like how we interact with others. And like it's really easy to forget that that's actually built into our brains. It's not like just something extra that you happen to live in the society. It's like the reason you live in a society and in a culture and all this, and why you have these feelings about other people, is because that's built into your brain. It's part of
Yeah.
like your neural architecture.
And I like you using the phrase tension too, because there's this great quote kind of in the group dynamics literature that said, if an individual's goals and the group's goals were the same, there'd be no difference between individualism and collectivism, right? There would be no need for me to give up my individual desires and my individual goals in place of the groups because they're aligned with it, right? And something that would be really interesting to talk about kind of in future episodes is leadership, right? Because I think ultimately what leadership is creating that vision, creating that idea that like this group is important. The things that we're doing are amazing. Like you should want to be a part of this group. There's the really popular Simon Sinek Start with Why is all based around identity principles, right? There are certain circumstances where if that group is really important to me, if it's really meaningful to me, I am going to shed my personal goals, my personal desires, my personal values in place of that group's goals and desires. And that's been the case throughout history, right? That's how religion operated. That's how most societies tried to organize behavior, right? They're trying to force people into like accepting the group's goals. Like, forget about your individuality. Like, you are a part of a system, right? and like pure individuality, like us actually viewing ourselves as like meaning makers, is a new concept. That's only within the last like 100 years that we've really started to delve into like how can we prop up the individual side of this and start bringing down the group side a little bit.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I remember I had this interview with Nicholas Christakis, who is this social scientist. He's also a doctor, but he talked about how like America, the founding of the United States was this really kind of historical revolution, because it was like, look, if you look at this problem of social cohesion, which is basically what we're talking about,
Hmm.
there are these two different ways of dealing with the like uncohesion, the group tensions that arise. Um, and it's, you can either go zoom all the way out to the level of the entire nation, and that was part of like what the American project was about, was making us
Hmm.
all Americans. You're not,
Yep.
you know, it doesn't matter what station in life you came from. Although, like, obviously at the beginning there was still slavery and a lot of
Yeah.
things that were a problem, but in principle, that idea that like all men are created equal, like because we're all Americans, we're all equal. But you can also zoom all the way into the level of the individual and say, well, we're all individuals. We're so
Hmm.
fundamentally like we deserve the same rights. And it was like the American project that kind of like put those together in this pretty potent mixture that has definitely had its problems and been imperfect throughout history, but
Yeah, yeah.
has this really good kind of like fusing of those ideas behind it.
Because I think that that's ultimately what governance is all about, is balancing that tension, is trying to figure out how to allow people to feel like they're important, to feel like they have autonomy, that they have the ability to make choices for themselves, like not forcing conformity on other people, but also having a vision that's strong enough that people actually believe in it. That's what you're talking about. I mean, the American dream was really strong back then. It was like, I want to be a part of this group, and I'm proud to be a part of this group, and so I am going to be okay signing that social contract. I'm going to be okay, like doing what they want me to, obeying their laws, all of these kind of things. And that's where we're at kind of a crossroads now, is trying to figure out where that tension kind of breaks and how we can still kind of respect the individual, but still have this kind of group identity that means something to us.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, it
So,
looks like we're nearing our time here. I know you got to get
yeah.
to a lab meeting or something,
Hmm.
right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So yeah, research beckons. But
Nice.
this has been absolutely fascinating. I'm really enjoying this. I'm definitely looking forward to future episodes. I want to put it out to our listeners too. Like, if there's anything social or even just about the brain in general that people want to hear about, let us know, because we're right now we're kind of organizing what our next episodes are going to be. So
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this was great. And make sure to subscribe to both of our channels if you feel the need. Yeah, and I guess we'll be probably back doing another one of these in a couple weeks, right?
yep, yep.
Okay,
Awesome.
cool.
See you, everybody.
All right, see you guys.